One of the greatest lessons I learned as a traveling trial watcher is that when the state has a weak case, one of the things that they will do to win is manipulate external influences, including language. I learned this most prominently through a drug conspiracy trial that I watched in Chicago. For context, the case at hand involves two defendants. The lead defendant is an African-American male and known member of the Gangster Disciples street gang. His co-defendant is a Hispanic male. According to the indictment, the lead defendant is accused of running a drug trafficking operation in the Chicago area, receiving methamphetamine, fentanyl, and cocaine from a supplier in Mexico via UPS. Communication between the lead defendant and the supplier in Mexico was facilitated by two inmates in a Texas prison who only spoke Spanish. The lead defendant, this African-American male, only speaks English, so he had to solicit the help from his Hispanic friend to interpret. Now, unbeknownst to these two men, the DEA, using wiretaps and surveillance, were recording their calls to these inmates and intercepted packages that were being sent to the lead defendant. And so that's how they ended up being charged in a drug conspiracy case. Now, at first glance, right, the state would have you believe that this is a case about drugs. But by the time I was done observing this trial, this case had nothing to do with drugs and everything to do with words and language. Why? Because the only evidence in this case were the wiretap conversations. In fact, each jury member was handed a very thick binder of transcripts, which under normal circumstances I would say was fine. But you see, the problem, right, is that the lead defendant, this African-American male, speaks African-American vernacular English, or as some people like to call it, Ebonics, which is considered a dialect of English that is widely spoken amongst the African-American population. And so I'm taking a look at this African-American male defendant, and I'm taking a look at this predominantly white jury. And I'm like, there's no way they understand what's being said in these transcripts. Like, I'm so sorry. Because, like, I'm Nigerian, but I was born and raised in Canada, and I don't even really understand what's being said in these transcripts. And I think the prosecution knew that they could use that to their advantage. Because you know what they did? Out of all of the defendant's words that were contained in this very thick binder of transcripts, the only words they conveniently managed to interpret were words that had to do with drug terminology. So you would just see in parentheses things like heroin, cocaine, fentanyl. That's it. They wouldn't provide context to any other thing that the defendant was saying in the transcripts, which is problematic, right? Because without context, things can literally get lost in translation. And that can mean the difference between spending years in prison and being let go, right? Being released. Think of it this way. Imagine you're catching up with a friend, and your friend tells you that they just got this new job that they really love. And in passing, you say something like, "That's dope." Meanwhile, the DEA is listening to your conversation and has the audacity to write in transcripts that at that moment when you said, "That's dope," that meant you were pointing to a stash of heroin. Because the word dope in slang term can refer to an illegal drug. It can also mean that something is cool or amazing, right? It's kind of like when someone says, "Hey, I just got this new amazing job and I'm really enjoying my time," and you say, "That's dope, congrats." And they did this not only to the lead defendant, but to his co-defendant, the Hispanic male. Because you know what the state did? And honestly, like, this is why I respect the genius of evil. Not evil itself, but the genius of evil. Because they did something so smart. In the jury instructions, they had the audacity to say, "By the way, the physical transcripts that we gave you are not actual evidence. The only evidence are the wiretap conversations that we play for you in court." And as I'm sitting there and I'm listening to these wiretap conversations that they're playing in court, I'm realizing that half of them are inaudible. So not only are the wiretap conversations, which is the only evidence, inaudible, the physical copy of the transcripts that they gave jury members to rely on are only providing context to drug terminology. And it gets worse, because not only did they manipulate language when it came to the lead defendant, they also manipulated or took advantage of language when it came to his co-defendant, the Hispanic male. Because in the jury instructions, right, get this, the state really had the audacity to tell jury members, by the way, if you're a native Spanish speaker, do not rely on your own understanding of the Spanish language. We will provide interpretations. Like, imagine your first language is Spanish and you have a whole prosecutor telling you, forget everything that your mother has taught you since you were an infant. From now on, you're going to rely on our interpreter. And it's like, okay, fine. But where is this interpreter from, right? Is my question. And it makes a difference. I would know. I also learned Spanish. And it's like, there are different dialects of Spanish, meaning the Spanish that's spoken in Argentina is not necessarily the same Spanish that's spoken in Spain or in Mexico, okay? In certain contexts, one word can mean one thing, but in a different context or in a different region, it can mean an entirely different thing, or maybe that word doesn't even exist at all. And so I'll give you an example, right? I just left Mexico where there was a hurricane, which is why my hair is all over the place. But anyway, I was in Mexico, I checked into this hotel, y estuve hablando en español con la recepcionista, okay? I was speaking Spanish with the receptionist. And so we were talking, she was welcoming me, showing me my room, blah, blah, blah. And when it got to showing me the security box, she switched to English to describe how to use the code. Because depending on where you're from or, you know, what version of Spanish you learned, there are apparently different ways to say hashtag. In one part of the Spanish-speaking world, you say gato. Where I'm from, do you know what gato means? It means cat. In other parts of the Spanish-speaking world, you might say el número, right? There's like 6 or 7 different ways to say hashtag. You might even say el hashtag, okay? And so where this interpreter is from, it matters. Is she culturally aware enough to understand Spanish from Belize, which is where the co-defendant is from? Does she have any credentials? And honestly, I can't even answer that question. Why? Because she's a ghost. I can't find her online. And that's saying a lot coming from someone like me, because I do better research than the CIA, Interpol, and the Mossad. Do you understand me? Nothing in this world can't be found unless I can't find it, okay? And I can't find this interpreter anywhere. Does she exist? I don't know. All of that to say, the state will literally manipulate external influences, including language, when they have no case and they need to win. And let's not underestimate the power of language and words here, right? I mean, there's so many expressions and idioms and proverbs that really speak to how powerful words and language are, right? One of my favorite expressions is, if culture is a door, language is the key, which, if anything, highlights why I was concerned when I realized that the state was not interpreting anything else that the defendant was saying and only did the due diligence of translating any words that alluded to drugs, or when they decided to tell jury members not to rely on their own understanding of the Spanish language without any consideration of whether or not their interpreter is culturally aware enough to understand what the co-accused or the 2 inmates in the Texas prison were saying. I mean, you have to understand, language in and of itself is very political, right? Throughout history, language, or rather the suppression of language, was used to commit cultural genocide, right? Think about Indigenous peoples in Canada who were not allowed to speak their own language inside of residential schools. Think about the language movement in Bangladesh. Like, make no mistake, words are not just words. And so language, or in this case, language barriers, or false interpretations can lead to unjust outcomes. And with how obsessed the state is with winning, it became quite clear throughout my journey of observing jury trials that the state will and can manipulate external influences to ensure a successful conviction. To learn more of some of the truths I learned as a traveling trial watcher, stay tuned for the next episode of Tried and True.